In Blender 4.3, we can now use grease pencil geometry with geometry nodes. So in this video, I'm going to be using it to make this geometry node simulation, where grease pencil strokes fly away from their drawn positions like emotional spaghetti. I originally made it for my new Nodes 4.3 video, which was also the geometry node section of Blender's official features overview, and people wanted to know how I did it. So here we are. My goal with this video is for it to be accessible to as many people as possible. But if you're new to geometry nodes, I highly recommend this video of mine, which people seem to find helpful. I'm really proud of it. It's the reason I get out of bed in the morning. "How's that video doing today?" the postman asks, and I reply, "I thought I told you never to speak to me again." So if at any time during this video I talk about something that's covered in depth in that video, you'll see this guy here. Okay, let's get started, shall we? Here is the grease pencil object I used in the new nodes video. I made it by adding a new grease pencil empty. Then, with that grease pencil empty selected, I switched to draw mode, adjusted the radius, and drew from the bottom of my heart. But I don't think that anyone wants to stare at that for 20 minutes, so let's just use what I used before. We can better understand what grease pencil geometry actually is by inspecting it in the spreadsheet. What we'll find there under grease pencil is one layer. That layer is called layer because I didn't rename it, and inside this we have 30 curve splines, one for each stroke, and the 12,500 points that the splines are made up of. Just like you, each of these points has a set of attributes which define who they are. The attribute that's important for us being the position, and each has its index number, its unique numerical identifier. We will be designing a geometry nodes tree that manipulates the position attributes of all of the points using their indices to know who is who. Leaving the spreadsheet behind, I'm now heading to the Properties panel where I'm going to click the Modifier tab and add a Geometry Nodes modifier with a new Geometry Nodes tree. Then, having pulled up the timeline, I will switch it to the Geometry Node Editor. Our grease pencil geometry travels through the tree along this green noodle from the group input to the group output, and to make it do what we want, we are going to add a whole circus of nodes between the two. Let's start with the grease pencil to curves node, which I am adding by pressing Shift A and then typing its name. Then, having placed the new node, we can pull noodles out of it like we're pulling an elastic band out of a dog. Or we can drop our node over an existing noodle and it threads right in. But I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to add nodes like this, in my deliberately minimalist depiction of the geometry node experience. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, I think it makes following the logic of the nodes easier, and secondly, because I clearly have a problem. So, the grease pencil to curves node has turned our layer into one instance, but we want what's inside that layer, our splines and points. Now 12,451 points is very generous, so we want to reduce this number so our simulation doesn't have to simulate so many points. To do that, I'm using a resample curve node, which looks like the first season of The Simpsons right now, but if I add a curves to grease pencil node, and then in the 3D viewport, turn off the outline selected overlay so we can better see the strokes, I can judge the effect on the grease pencil object as I adjust the resampling. The goal is to find the optimum resample length. We want as few points as possible, so this means we want as long a length as possible, but not so long that we don't have enough points to maintain the shapes of our strokes. In this example, point 3 seems to be our Goldilocks, reducing the original point payload by 78%. Next, I'm adding a simulation zone, which is the name for this purple area guarded by an entrance node and an exit node. Everything we do to the splines and their points while they are in this zone is repeated on every frame. For example, we're currently on the first frame, frame 1. If we add a set position node with an offset of 1 on X, we can see that our points are now offset 1 on X. This is the same as would happen without the zone, but if we go to the next frame, the geometry goes through the zone again and the offset is applied again. So if we press play, on each frame the set position offsets the geometry from where it was offset to on the previous frame. What we are going to build is basically just a more ambitious version of this. So let's give the point some direction, shall we? With this store named attribute node, we're going to store the initial tangents of each point as a named attribute, which we will call starting tangent. The curve tangent field node instructing each point to take their own tangent and store it as their value for the new attribute. For those of you, like me, who thought a tangent was a polite man just back from vacation, it turns out it's not. The tangent of a point is the direction of the curve at that point. It is a vector, and if we used it as a position, the direction to this position from 0, 0, 0 is the direction of the curve. And it's a normalized vector, which means it has a length of 1, so the distance between it and 0, 0, 0 is 1. You can think of the curve tangent like an offset. If we were to offset a point by this vector on the x, y, and z axes, it would move 1 in the curve's direction. Actually, you don't just have to think of it like an offset because we are going to use it as one. And don't worry, we're not going to do anything as intense as that again. We're going to access our new starting tangent attribute with a named attribute node. This will instruct the set position node to use the starting tangent of each point as its offset. And if we press play, each point now moves 1 unit in the direction of its starting tangent on every frame. Now, rather than plugging the starting tangents in as offsets, we want to use them to calculate absolute positions for the points and plug those into the position input. Right now, they're tangents, so they all huddle 1 unit away from 0, 0, 0. To make them positions that have been offset, we'll add them to a position field node. Now, the instruction for every point on every frame is to use as its position the sum of 2 of its attributes, its starting tangent and its position, which offsets our points exactly as before, but we made it ourselves, so somehow it just feels better. Next, we're adding a repeat zone. This is like the simulation zone, but instead of repeating on every frame, it repeats immediately a given number of times. Now, much of what we build in the next section is possible without this zone, and when we get to the moment it becomes a necessity, I'll do my best George Bailey impression and we'll look at what life at that point would be like without it. But where we're eventually going, we will need it, so I'm tying strings on my fingers and introducing it now. We want the repeat zone to repeat or iterate once for every point of our geometry, so using a domain size node, I can select curve, then plug the point count into the repeat zone's iterations. Hiding the unused sockets with Ctrl-H, then threading our geometry noodle through the new zone, including our set position node. Back in the 3D viewport, it looks like we've lost everything. But if we zoom all the way out to a comfortable cruising altitude, we can see that actually it's all still there. What's happening is every point is being moved in each one of the repeat zone's iterations, so they're all being offset by the starting tangent 2,812 times. That's cool, but it's not for us. So, the first thing to do is add a switch. Change it to a vector switch, then put it between the starting tangent and the set position, with the starting tangent as true. To control the switch, we'll use endpoint selection, so it's only true for the first point of each spline or stroke. And we can see now that it's only those points that are attempting to leave the atmosphere. All of the others are now being set to the false vector, 0, 0, 0. So let's plug a position field node into the switch's false. If the endpoint selection is false, this node will instruct the set position to use the point's position as its position, which means they don't move. We still have the set position happening 2,812 times though. This socket here tells us which iteration we're currently in. We can plug this integer into a compare node using its result for the set position, telling it to only set the position when the comparison is true. In this case, if the iteration number is equal to the index of the point. If I press play, we can see that now only the first point of each spline is moving, and it's only moving once per frame. So let's review. On every frame, the repeat zone repeats as many times as there are points. In these repeats, the position of a point is only set if its index number is the same as the iteration number. And if it is, one of two things will happen. If it's the first point of a spline, it'll be offset by its starting tangent, and if it's not, it won't move. Now, like I said earlier, it's not necessary to use a repeat zone to do this. In fact, if we remove it, the domain size and the index condition will get the same result. So what are we doing here, Harry? Well, we want each spline to behave like a chain, which means we want the first point in each spline offset by the tangent, then each subsequent point influenced by the offset position of its predecessor. For this to work, we need to set each point's position sequentially, one by one, down the spline. This version doesn't allow us to do that, because it sets them all at the same time. That's why we need to go back. Not back to the island, but back to the repeat zone. To get the position of the points after they've been set, we're going to use a sample index node to sample the position attribute, making sure to change the data type to vector. For the index, we'll use the iteration number. So in each iteration, we'll get the position of the point that's the subject of that iteration. Okay, but how do we pass it to the next iteration then? We're going to do it in the same way that we pass the geometry. We're going to send it through the zone's output, because just like a portal, whatever passes through the zone's output in one iteration is passed back through the zone's input into the next. Now, at the start of the repeat zone, we can take the resolved position of the previous point and using a mix node, mix it with our position field node, which for every point will give us the current position of that point. So in each iteration, its point is having its position mixed with the newly mixed position of the previous iteration's point. While your brain is deciding whether or not to shut down, I'm going to open the timeline so we can see it just a little bit and then change the end frame to 400. I'm actually doing this because it'll be useful later, but I don't know why I'm explaining myself to you. Pressing spacebar to play, we can now watch all the control points move. The first points of each spline offset on each frame by the starting tangent, and all the others having their position mixed forwards towards their predecessor. And it's starting to look like something. Not our something, but something nonetheless. The first thing to address is that the first points are moving in the wrong direction, because the starting tangents aim down the splines and we want the opposite, so they pull away from themselves. The second thing is we need some noise. So we're heading down to our starting tangent to add a vector math node. Selecting scale so we can scale it by -1, and by doing so, reverse it. Next, we want to add some noise to the direction, and we'll do that by adding noise. We'll turn off normalize so that the noise doesn't range from 0 to 1 on each axis, but spreads evenly from positive to negative, and then tweak the scale. Before I press play this time, I'm going to check that I set the timeline to play every frame, because if we don't, we won't simulate every frame, and what we are playing will be inaccurate. That's how sensitive these things are, because as we all know, if a butterfly flaps its wings in my garden, it can cause you many miles away to like and subscribe. Now, with the noise added, it's a little wiggly, but the splines still head more or less in steady directions. This is because the effect of the noise on one frame isn't being carried through to the next. Our calculation is, unlike us, oblivious to any noise from its past. We can fix this, the calculation that is, by mixing the reversed starting tangent with a curved tangent field node, which for each point gives its current tangent. Shift D to duplicate the scale node because we'll want this reversed too. The more we mix towards the starting tangent, the more inclined our points will be to head outwards in a constant direction. The more towards the curved tangent, the current tangent that was influenced by the noise on the previous frame, and we willingly embrace chaos. Now the points don't just wiggle, they curve and change direction. I'm speeding this up so you can see our last curve shape challenge. They stretch. This is because there is nothing in the node tree telling the points to maintain their distance from each other, so next we need to put a geometry node restraining order on them. Oh look, it's another one of these. Let's take 2 points and use them to work out how we're going to maintain our lengths, shall we? These two, index 41 and index 42. And we'll focus on just them so we don't lose our minds. Imagine we're mid-simulation, I don't know, like frame 217, and we're ploughing through its repeat zone iterations, having just resolved iteration 41, where point 41's new position was set, let's say, to here. Now we're in iteration 42, so it's 42's turn, and their current position from the last frame gets mixed with 41's new position. This is what we're currently doing, the points dragging each other along, creating a satisfying wiggly flow. But just mixing the positions doesn't keep the 2 points at a fixed distance, and that's bad, because we don't want the length between them to change. To fix this, we're still going to calculate the mixed position, but we're not going to move 42 to it. Instead, we are going to use it to calculate its offset from 41. And if we normalize this, we will get a tangent vector in the same direction, but with a length of 1. Do you remember way back when you were young, when you first started watching this video and we resampled our curves by a length of 0.3? Well, of course, that is the original distance between our points. And if we scale the normalized vector by 0.3, the offset will then have a length of 0.3. Then all we have to do to calculate our final new position for 42 is add this adjusted offset back onto 41's position. That's the theory. Now let's put it into practice with some nodes. So we have our mixed position and we want to subtract the position of the previous iteration's point from it, which gives us the mixed position's offset from that point. And then we'll normalize this vector so it has a length of 1, before scaling it by our resample length of 0.3, making its length now 0.3. And then we'll take this vector which has been conformed to the correct length and add it back onto the previous point's position. Now, when we press play, we will almost immediately press stop, because with the added calculations, like me, it's moving a lot slower than it was before. In order to look at how we bake simulations, I'm going to break the fourth wall and return to reality. This is what my node tree really looks like. I know, this is disappointing, but let me find the simulation zone output and we can get back to my carefully crafted lies. There it is. Pressing N to open the sidebar and selecting the Node tab, where we scroll down to find the Bake button, which will pre-simulate the simulation, so it doesn't have to do all that math on the fly. There's a progress bar at the bottom, and I'm going to speed this up a bit because, yes, these videos are edited. We are baked, so I'm heading back to the timeline and my delusional perfectionism, where this purple bar here denotes the frames that have been baked. Shift and the left arrow to go back to the first frame, then pressing play. Now we have strokes that not only soar and wiggle, they are also 100% stretch resistant, and they do all of this in 3D. You don't even have to wear those stupid glasses. If I had something to do with my time, I'd probably end this here, but there is one absolutely final thing to address. Acceleration. Our strokes make pretty shapes, but at the moment they are either moving or they're not, and we want them to ease in so when reversed they smoothly slide into place. We're going to do this by storing a named attribute called speed, which like the set position, will only store on a point if we're in the iteration that corresponds to it. Next, I'm going to generate a random value between 0 and 60 using the curve index for the ID, so every point in a spline will get the same random number. If we compare this to the frame number, we can get a true result if the random number is less than or equal to the frame number, or, which is probably much easier to understand, if the frame number is greater than the random number. Then we'll use this result with a switch, so we can add 0 to the speed if it's false and 0.1 if it's true. So if the frame number is greater than the random number, the speed increases by 0.1. And because we don't want any more points on our license, we are going to enforce a speed limit by clamping this value between 0 and 1. You can actually do that with the math node, but I was so tired when I made this bit. Back at the tangents and noise, we can scale them both with our new speed attribute, which, when the frame number reaches a random number between 0 and 60, will increase on each frame by 0.1 until it's clamped at 1. I'm adding a float curve to make the acceleration as smooth as a snake at a disco. You can refine your curve so it's the shape of your favorite mountain. And finally, I'm adding a math multiply node. We will use this to adjust our top speed. And as a group of scared children once said in a Stephen King novel, that is it. This node tree is actually adapted from something else I'm working on. This is Derek, a wiggly wobbly procedural thing. If I ever recover from making this video, Derek will be the subject of my next project video because everyone needs a Derek. If you haven't yet liked and subscribed, it would mean a lot to him if you did. And there's a Patreon too if you're so inclined. I'm going to rack focus to give a shout out to my top tier members. A big thanks to them for their awesome support. Now, there's nothing left for me to do but lie on the couch with a family-sized bag of Monster Munch and watch the Golden Girls. Goodbye.